On February 17, 2001, firefighters responding to a burning vehicle in Dorchester County, South Carolina, made a horrific discovery. Inside the trunk of the charred car lay the body of 21-year-old Candy Louise Martin, a young mother who had recently given birth. The brutal crime shocked the community, but the investigation quickly pointed to someone she once considered a friend. Just a day before her murder, Martin had met up with 20-year-old Marion Bowman Jr., a former high school acquaintance, over an unresolved financial dispute. Witnesses recalled hearing Bowman issue a chilling threat, promising Martin that she would not live past sundown. That evening, Martin arrived at a house where Bowman and his friends had been drinking. As the night progressed, Bowman and his cousin, James Gadsden, joined her in her car, setting in motion a tragic chain of events. Gadsden later testified that Bowman made his deadly intentions clear, declaring outright that he was going to kill Martin. Moments later, Bowman pulled out a firearm and shot her multiple times, ignoring her desperate pleas for her life and her newborn child. The cold-blooded nature of the crime was amplified by his lack of hesitation. There was no argument, no struggle, just sheer, ruthless execution. After the murder, Bowman ensured Gadsden's silence by threatening him, making it clear that speaking out would cost him his life. Still determined to profit from his crime, Bowman drove Martin's car back to town, attempting to sell it as if nothing had happened. When he failed to find a buyer, he reached out to his friend Travis Felder, roping him into the cover-up. Together, they returned to the murder site, stuffing Martin's lifeless body into the trunk of her own car. With no regard for her or the life she had just brought into the world, they set the vehicle ablaze before fleeing the scene. The investigation moved quickly, with forensic evidence tying Bowman to the crime within hours of the body being discovered. Authorities linked him to Martin through DNA evidence, leaving no doubt about his involvement. His arrest at the age of 20 marked the beginning of a long legal battle, but justice was inevitable. Over the years, he remained behind bars, serving his time while the weight of his actions loomed over him. After 24 years in prison, his execution date was officially set for January 31, 2025, bringing closure to a case that had haunted the community for decades. Next on the list, Stephen LaWayne Nelson. On March 3, 2011, Stephen LaWayne Nelson committed a brutal and senseless murder inside North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. His target was not just money or valuables. His crime escalated to a horrific act of violence. Nelson, accompanied by 2 accomplices, initially planned to rob the church but was confronted by Pastor Clint Dobson and his assistant, Judy Elliott. In a fit of cruelty, Nelson mercilessly beat Dobson, suffocated him with a plastic bag, and left Elliott unconscious after severely assaulting her. Before fleeing, he stole Dobson's car, laptop, and other personal belongings, leaving behind a crime scene drenched in horror. Elliott miraculously survived the attack and later provided key testimony that led to Nelson's arrest. Investigators quickly linked Nelson to the crime through stolen property and DNA evidence, solidifying his role in the pastor's murder. His past was riddled with violence, but this crime marked a shocking level of brutality. In 2012, Nelson was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, a punishment fitting the horrific nature of his actions. However, his violent tendencies did not end with Dobson's murder, as he would later claim another life behind bars. While awaiting trial for Dobson's murder, Nelson displayed his violent nature once again within prison walls. In 2013, he was implicated in the killing of fellow inmate Jonathan Holden at the Tarrant County Jail. Reports indicated that Holden was strangled to death, and Nelson later bragged about the act, showcasing a disturbing lack of remorse. His behavior further cemented his reputation as a dangerous individual, one who posed a continuous threat to those around him. After spending years on death row, he is now scheduled for execution by lethal injection on February 5, 2025, bringing an end to his reign of terror. At the time of his crimes, Nelson was only 24 years old, but his actions reflected a chilling disregard for human life. Throughout his incarceration, his aggressive and violent tendencies remained a concern for both prison officials and fellow inmates. With his execution date set, the families of his victims may finally receive the justice they have long awaited. Nelson's case serves as a grim reminder of how unchecked violence can destroy multiple lives. Soon, the legal system will carry out the ultimate sentence for a man whose brutality knew no bounds. Next on the list, Demetrius Terrence Frazier is a convicted murderer and serial rapist whose crimes left a trail of devastation across multiple states. In 1991, he committed a heinous act in Birmingham, Alabama, when he raped and murdered 40-year-old Pauline Brown. The following year, his violence escalated as he targeted 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick in Detroit, Michigan. His attack on Kendrick was especially gruesome, as he attempted to sexually assault the young girl before ultimately killing her. These two known murders, along with the numerous rapes he committed, made him one of the most feared predators of his time. Frazier's crimes were not isolated incidents, as he was later linked to the rapes of at least 8 other women in Michigan. Authorities painstakingly gathered evidence, connecting him to a string of violent offenses that spanned several years. In 1993, he was convicted in Michigan for Kendrick's murder and multiple sexual assaults, receiving multiple life sentences. However, justice had not yet fully caught up with him, as he still had to answer for Brown's murder in Alabama. His history of terrorizing women finally reached a breaking point when he was extradited to face trial in a different state. In 1996, an Alabama court convicted Frazier of capital murder for Brown's death, and he was sentenced to death. His lengthy criminal history painted a clear picture of a man who had no regard for human life, repeatedly preying on vulnerable individuals. Despite his conviction, he spent nearly 2 decades in Michigan's Alger Maximum Correctional Facility before being transferred to Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility in 2011. Over the years, appeals and legal battles prolonged his time on death row, but the state of Alabama remained committed to carrying out his execution. His victims' families, after decades of grief, may now see the justice system deliver its final judgment. Frazier, who was only 19 years old when he was first convicted, is now 52 years old. His execution is scheduled for February 6, 2025, and will be carried out using nitrogen hypoxia, a newly authorized method in Alabama. This execution will mark the end of a dark chapter, ensuring that Frazier is never able to harm another innocent victim again. Next on the list, James Dennis Ford. In 1997, James Dennis Ford committed a brutal double homicide in Charlotte County, Florida, targeting Greg and Kimberly Minor. Ford, who worked alongside Greg at South Florida Sod Farm, manipulated the couple into joining him on what seemed like an innocent fishing trip. However, his true intentions were far more sinister. Once they arrived at the remote location, he sexually assaulted Kimberly before fatally shooting both her and Greg. His calculated cruelty shocked the community, and investigators quickly built a strong case against him. In 1999, Ford was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, sexual battery with a firearm, and child abuse. Ford's crimes earned him a death sentence for each murder, along with additional prison terms for the other offenses. Over the years, he exhausted various appeals in an attempt to overturn his fate, but the courts upheld his convictions. His case remained under legal scrutiny for decades until Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant on January 10, 2025. This decision officially scheduled his execution by lethal injection for February 13, 2025, bringing an end to his prolonged stay on death row. Ford, who was just 36 years old when he was arrested, ultimately spent 28 years behind bars awaiting his execution. Next on the list. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel and like the videos you watch. Your support will help us to grow and create more great content like this. Thank you. Now let's continue. Richard Lee Tabler. On Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 2004, Richard Lee Tabler carried out a calculated and violent attack that left 4 people dead in Killeen, Texas. His first victims were Mohammed Amin Ramuni, the manager of Teaser nightclub, and his friend Hayam Zad, whom Tabler lured to a secluded area under the false promise of selling stereo equipment. Once they arrived, he executed both men in cold blood, showing no remorse for his actions. Just 2 days later, he continued his killing spree, targeting 18-year-old Amanda Benefield and 16-year-old Tiffany Lorraine Dotson, both dancers at the same nightclub. The sheer brutality of these crimes sent shockwaves through the community, leaving law enforcement determined to bring him to justice. In April 2007, Tabler was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death for his ruthless killings. However, his criminal behavior did not end behind bars. While on death row, he illegally obtained a cell phone, using it to make threatening calls, including one directed at a Texas state senator. This blatant disregard for the law only reinforced the court's decision to uphold his death sentence despite multiple appeals. His efforts to delay his execution proved futile, and the state of Texas remained resolute in carrying out his punishment. After 21 years of incarceration, Tabler was executed by lethal injection on February 13, 2024, marking the final chapter in a life defined by violence and crime. Next on the list, David Leonard Wood, infamously known as the Desert Killer, terrorized El Paso, Texas, during the summer of 1987. Between May and August of that year, he preyed on at least 6 young women and girls, brutally murdering them before burying their bodies in the vast desert. His crimes sent waves of fear throughout the community, as authorities struggled to piece together the horrifying pattern of disappearances. After years of investigation, Wood was finally apprehended and, in 1992, convicted of capital murder. The courts sentenced him to death, branding him one of Texas's most ruthless serial killers. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, Wood has consistently denied responsibility for the murders. Over the years, he has pursued various legal avenues, primarily focusing on DNA testing to challenge his conviction. In 2010, he was granted his first motion for DNA analysis, but subsequent appeals and legal disputes stretched the proceedings out for more than a decade. In 2020, a trial court officially denied further DNA testing, and in 2022, his last request was rejected, effectively sealing his fate. Now 67 years old, Wood remains on death row at the Allen B. Polanski unit in Texas, with his execution scheduled for March 13, 2025, by lethal injection, marking the end of his decades-long fight to escape justice. Next on the list, Wendell Arden Graham's violent crime shocked the small community of Blaine County, Oklahoma, in 2005. During a brutal home invasion, Graham and his accomplice, Jesse Johns, stormed into a residence with deadly intent. The attack turned fatal when Graham shot and killed 23-year-old Amber Matthews while wounding another woman, leaving the home a blood-stained scene of chaos. Law enforcement quickly identified and arrested both men, ensuring they faced justice for their crimes. In 2008, Graham was convicted of first-degree murder and multiple related charges, receiving a death sentence along with additional prison terms. Unlike many convicted murderers who maintain their innocence, Graham has expressed deep remorse for his actions. In his confession, he admitted, "I don't know what made me do what I did," a statement that did little to ease the grief of his victims' loved ones. Despite his regrets, his legal appeals failed to overturn his conviction, and the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his death sentence. After nearly 2 decades behind bars, his time on death row is nearing its end. Now 56 years old, Graham is set to be executed by lethal injection on March 20, 2025, bringing a final resolution to a crime that left an indelible scar on the community. Next on the list, Moises Sandoval Mendoza was convicted of the brutal 2004 capital murder of 20-year-old Rel O'Neal Tolson in Collin County, Texas. Mendoza abducted Tolson from her home and subjected her to a horrific ordeal of sexual assault and strangulation before ultimately taking her life with a knife. In an attempt to hide his crime, he transported her body to a field behind his house, where he tried to destroy the evidence by setting it on fire. Authorities quickly linked him to the crime, and after a thorough investigation, he was arrested and charged. In June 2005, a jury found Mendoza guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death at the age of 20. Now having spent 21 years on death row, Mendoza's execution is scheduled for April 23, 2025. His case has remained a stark example of violent crime and the justice system's response to such acts. Despite the passage of time, his punishment has remained unchanged, and legal efforts to overturn his sentence have been unsuccessful. The details of his crime, abduction, sexual assault, and premeditated murder were instrumental in securing the death penalty. With his execution date approaching, his case continues to be a reminder of the severity of capital punishment in Texas. Next on the list, Percy June Hutton was born on October 28, 1953, and was convicted in 1986 for the murder of Derek Ricky Mitchell and the attempted murder of Samuel Simmons Jr. in Cleveland, Ohio. The violent encounter was reportedly sparked by a dispute over a stolen sewing machine, a seemingly minor argument that escalated into a fatal act. Hutton shot and killed Mitchell, while Simmons survived the attack, providing key testimony in the case. He was sentenced to death for the murder and given additional prison time for the attempted murder. His conviction and sentencing were followed by decades of legal battles, with multiple appeals and reviews of his case. Originally set to be executed on June 22, 2022, Hutton's execution was postponed due to complications with Ohio's lethal injection protocol. In response to ongoing issues, Governor Mike DeWine rescheduled his execution for June 18, 2025. With 39 years behind bars, Hutton is one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Ohio. His case has drawn attention not only for the nature of his crime but also for the lengthy appeals process that has delayed his execution for nearly 4 decades. As his execution date nears, it remains to be seen whether any final legal challenges will alter the course of his fate. Next on the list, Samuel Moreland. In November 1985, Samuel Moreland committed a gruesome crime that shocked Dayton, Ohio. He brutally murdered 5 members of a single family, including 3 innocent children, during a violent rampage. The sheer brutality of the crime led to his conviction in 1986, where he was sentenced to death for his actions. Moreland has spent over 3 decades on Ohio's death row, exhausting legal appeals while awaiting his fate. In August 2021, the Ohio Supreme Court officially scheduled his execution for July 30, 2025, marking a definitive end to his prolonged legal battles. Next on the list, Douglas Lamont Coey. Born on August 24, 1975, Douglas Lamont Coey was convicted of the 1997 murder of 21-year-old Samar Ello in Toledo, Ohio. The crime, which was marked by its senseless violence, led to Coey receiving a death sentence in 1998. Since then, he has spent 29 years behind bars, with multiple delays in his execution. In 2022, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine intervened, issuing a reprieve that postponed Coey's execution, shifting the date far into the future. As of now, his execution is scheduled for September 24, 2125, making it highly unlikely he will ever face the sentence originally imposed upon him. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel and like the videos you watch. Your support will help us to grow and create more great content like this. Thank you. Now let's continue. Next on the list, Timothy L. Coleman was born on August 23, 1969, and later became infamous for the brutal murder of Melinda Stevens in Springfield, Ohio. Stevens, a confidential informant for the Springfield Police Department, had played a crucial role in past drug-related investigations involving Coleman. On January 2, 1996, she was found shot to death in an alley behind a local restaurant, a crime that shocked the community. Authorities quickly identified Coleman as the primary suspect, and he was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. During his trial, damning evidence surfaced, including statements he made to fellow inmates that strongly suggested his guilt. In 1999, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld Coleman's conviction and death sentence, solidifying his fate on death row. Prosecutors argued that his motive for the murder was to silence Stevens due to her cooperation with law enforcement. Witness testimonies and forensic evidence painted a chilling picture of the crime, leaving little doubt about his involvement. Despite various legal appeals, his sentence remained unchanged, and his execution date was set. Now 50 years old, Coleman has spent 3 decades in prison, awaiting his scheduled execution on October 30, 2025. Next on the list, Kareem M. Jackson was convicted of the ruthless 1997 murders of Anthony and Oro Hunter and Terrence Walker in Columbus, Ohio. The crime was particularly heinous, as Jackson shot and killed both victims in cold blood, leaving the city reeling from the violence. Authorities swiftly arrested him, and by 1998, he was convicted and sentenced to death for the double homicide. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence during his trial, including witness statements and forensic analysis, which solidified his guilt. Jackson, only 23 years old at the time of his conviction, was sentenced to die for his crimes. Since his sentencing, Jackson has remained incarcerated at the Ross Correctional Institution, where he has spent nearly 3 decades behind bars. His execution has faced repeated delays, largely due to Ohio's ongoing struggles in obtaining lethal injection drugs. In May 2022, Governor Mike DeWine issued another reprieve, pushing Jackson's execution back once again, this time to December 10, 2025. The repeated postponements have sparked debates about capital punishment, with some questioning whether the delays amount to cruel and unusual punishment. After 28 years in prison, Jackson continues to await his fate, as legal battles and logistical challenges prolong his time on death row.